homestead, they always say it's another beautiful day at the homestead. So I guess in the Ivies holders. If we were on the West Coast, they would be loving this weather because they've had such droughts. Here in the East, I hope that we will all be able to have a safe trip home over the mountains and on these rural roads. It is always an interesting experience as to what the weather is going to be, and of course, counties can always take credit for the sunshine. It's a state responsibility if it's anything else. A quick reminder before we begin, the annual business meeting starts at 10:30 right here, and I would ask that everyone stay for that meeting. That is where we are going to elect our incoming officers and swear in our regional directors. So please stay for this very important part of our annual conference. This morning I am pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, who probably is not a stranger to most of us because we have heard him before, and he is always right on target with a lot of good comments about Virginia politics. Jeff Schapiro is political columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch. He has covered campaigns and government for nearly 35 years, a period during which Virginia has emerged as a decisive swing state, prized by national political parties and all their advertising dollars into the state. Jeff joined the Times-Dispatch in 1987 after reporting from the state capitol for United Press International and Virginia Business Magazine. He's covered 9 gubernatorial campaigns, 10 governors, every session of the General Assembly since 1981. Molly, I feel for you. Nearly 10 presidential primaries and conventions, as well as dozens of congressional and legislative elections. His column appears in the Times-Dispatch on Wednesdays and Sundays. He is a 2015 inductee of the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame at Virginia Commonwealth University. He's a native of New York City, graduated from Georgetown University with a bachelor's degree in history. And his wife, Claire, is a food columnist for the Times-Dispatch. So journalism runs in the family. Won't you please join me in welcoming Jeff Schapiro.
My instructions were to turn this on, and it works. If you don't object, I thought I would just sort of visit with you all. I was talking with Jim Campbell earlier this morning, and it really was my hope that this be more a conversation than some blowhard speaking ex cathedra about affairs in the Holy City and the frustratingly limited influence that local government seems to have on the legislature of Virginia. It's supposed to be an applause line. A couple of points, and that's the subject I hope you can explore a bit. The association has a long and storied and steady leadership in Jim Campbell, who I know many of you have worked with closely over the years, and Jim, who is, shall we say, an embodiment of grace under pressure, or whose threshold for pain is considerably higher than that of many mortals, has decided to take, as they say in the federal judiciary, senior status. There's one word for it, retirement, and a well-deserved retirement it is. So I congratulate him on going gentle into that good night. Maybe that's a bit extreme. And I commend you and your organization for assuring a continuum in selecting his longtime deputy, Dean Lynch, as your new director. I think it is safe to say that VACo remains sure and steady and reliable hands. Also, congratulations to many of you, having been, as the late Hunter Andrews, the leader of the Finance Committee of the Senate would say, been refreshed by the people. That Jeffersonian flourish was one that Hunter Andrews used better than most. I think Hunter Andrews also may have been a more reliable partner to local government than we've seen in recent years, but within limits. And I think it's important to note as well that this being a legislative election, a just concluded legislative election season, that if it weren't for these spirited, in many cases, local elections for the Board of Supervisors and the constitutional officers, that at least one state Senate election might not have turned out as it did. So as goes Powhatan.
Hey, Jeff.
Everett, how are you? Good to see you again. In the mountains of Virginia, as opposed to the concrete canyons of northern Virginia. So goes the 10th senatorial district. The local elections, I think, were fascinating because as representatives of bodies that are closest to the people, you know that more often than not, people aren't interested in party affiliation. They want to know whether the drainage ditches are clear, the roads are safe to navigate, even though that's all VDOT's jobs. But the level of competition could be acute. In Powhatan County, which turned out over 10,000 votes, all of the supervisory seats were contested and all the constitutional seats, offices were contested. And that was a pattern that played out around the state as well. I visited with a couple of supervisory candidates in Wythe County. Joe Hale, the incumbent, who was re-elected to a supervisory seat that ordinarily frowns, or supervisory district that ordinarily frowns on re-electing anyone, did. And in nearby, I think there were about 20 names on the ballot, if not more. In Giles County, next door, there were 55 names on the ballot. That's a lot of choices, and for those of you who were driving the back roads of Giles County, that's a lot of litter and trash too. Those signs have to go somewhere after these elections are over. And I'm curious, I wonder if there are any supervisory candidates who do what Tom Bliley, a longtime congressman from the 3rd and the 7th District of Virginia, which is Central Virginia, would do. He offered a bounty to constituents, Democrats and Republicans, who harvested yard signs and brought them into his office. That was his contribution to a minor, symbolic certainly, contribution to a cleaner Virginia. Despite all of the enthusiasm at the local level, turnout statewide was abominably low. It was worse this cycle than it was 4 years ago, the last time Virginians chose a House of Delegates and a state Senate. Then it was almost 29%. The initial calculations by the Board of Elections is that this year it was 26%. It's amazing considering how much money was spent, $45 million. And the Democrats alone, obviously the stakes were considerably higher for Governor McAuliffe and his party, depending on how one does their arithmetic. They spent about $20 million. And the outcome brings to mind a movie many of you may have seen, Groundhog Day. So for all the money and all the hot air, the Senate remains in Republican hands, 21 Republicans, 19 Democrats. The House of Delegates firmly in Republican control. The Democrats had a net gain of 1 seat. So the Republicans are going to have to make do with 66 seats rather than 67. That's that supermajority number. So sadly, Bill Howell's been frustrated. Not really. The election in suburban Richmond for that state Senate seat, the one in which the Powhatan result was crucial. This was the seat that was going to decide it all for the Democrats. Member of the County Board of Supervisors, Chesterfield County Board of Supervisors, Dan Gecker was the Democratic nominee, Republican nominee, Glenn Sturtevant, a school board trustee from Richmond. And it was a rather fascinating sort of election in that what happens when folks like yourselves, who may have a party preference but generally are seen as nonpartisan, what happens when these candidates don the team jersey? What reaction does that generate among voters? And for Glenn Sturtevant, a Republican in a heavily Democratic city, it was clear that the Democrats, the volume of the vote in the city, that they weren't too happy about that. And in Chesterfield County, the volume of the vote indicated that Republican-leaning Chesterfield, and as we say in political journalism, behavioral Republicans weren't too happy about that. If you parse the results on that election, you'll see that ultimately the winning votes for Sturtevant came largely out of Chesterfield, which is 45% of that district. But that Powhatan result, that was the icing on the cake. And as you know, local elections can often be somewhat balky to cover on election night. And we were having some difficulty at the Times-Dispatch getting a return out of Powhatan County. And when the Board of Elections indicated that the incumbent Republican delegate from Powhatan County, Lee Ware, Robert Lee Ware, had been re-elected unopposed with over 10,000 votes, and it was clear that Dan Gecker was toast. Now, what were the issues that rippled through that election and some of these other decisive or allegedly decisive elections in Northern Virginia, in the Roanoke area, at Virginia Beach? And I'll try to go through some of them quickly. Well, there was obviously all of the out-of-state money that was supporting all of that anti-gun advertising, Bloomberg advertising. It got people revved up on both sides. I think it's important to note that Chesterfield is not the lopsidedly Republican rotten borough it was when I moved to Central Virginia in 1979. It's not producing the same kinds of heavy 5-digit returns for Republicans that it once did. And I suspect that that's a consequence of several things. One, Chesterfield is increasingly, if you will, a national suburb. As more people move to the area from out of state. Mind you, the majority of Virginians, 51%, were not born in the state. So, and as among the come-heres who has infected your beloved Commonwealth. But this has a substantial effect on the political culture of the state. People who come in here from, well, pick a state, who are accustomed to voting on a single day for a president, for a governor, for members of Congress, for state legislators, for local elected officials, to have to go through this, it seems only in Virginia, exercise of an election every year in which turnout steadily falls, and those steadily falling turnouts seem only to work to the advantage of the status quo. You know, when 1 in 4 voters turn out in districts that are drawn to produce a certain result, you know, why bother having an election? You know, 122 incumbents stood for re-election, and 122 were re-elected. Doesn't sound like much of an election to me. But getting back to the 10th senatorial district, that suburban Richmond district that had a blue cast, that had been falling to Barack Obama, that had been carried by Mark Warner, that was showing a preference for Democratic gubernatorial candidates. Really a swing district, particularly in an off-year election such as this one. And other issues that clearly drove that election. This continuing debate over health care. And I suspect that despite the preferences of the Republican leadership in the General Assembly, that I suspect there are a good number of people in local government who figure, well, if Virginia only helped itself to some of this money, that would take some pressure off of the general fund, and that would mean more money for local government. Well, don't get your wishes. Healthcare was an issue, like guns, sort of national in cast, that was intended primarily by the Democrats to get the base jazzed up, to get some of those newcomer Democratic voters who ordinarily wouldn't participate in these elections because, you know, they didn't know they were going on, or they couldn't establish any tie between their own lot and whatever these elected officials were doing, that maybe it would drive them to the polls. Statewide turnout of 26%? Apparently not. Those issues, however, made a difference up in Northern Virginia for an open Democratic seat, state Senate seat. Chuck Columnist, the longest-serving state senator, who I think may be known to a good number of you. That was held by the Democrats rather comfortably. But I suspect that one of the reasons a lot of these issues, such as health care and firearms, resonated even more strongly up there is that Prince William is in the shadow of the nation's capital. And there are, those of you from north of the Occoquan, or actually I guess now basically north of the Stafford-Prince William line, know that local politics and federal politics are essentially indecipherable. I'm wondering if that, despite this very strange, seemingly unique to Virginia election schedule, is only going to continue as Washington creeps farther and farther south. Virginia is a fascinating state, given the speed with which it has grown, given the speed with which its economy has been reinvented, and given the speed with which political and economic power has shifted. In 1900, the state had a population of just under 2 million. 90% of the people who lived here were born here. The state's economy was driven by agriculture. And the state was quite poor, still dealing with the after effects of the Civil War. By the Second World War, when the federal government was pouring billions into the state, supporting war industries, through that exercise in federal beneficence, the template of what would be the ultimate suburbanization of Virginia was put in place. But still, even with that defining event, the global war, Virginia remained a heavily rural state. 1945, the first gubernatorial election following the Second World War, Bill Tuck. Anyone here from Halifax County? All right. The man who looked like he'd just eaten 12 pork chops and probably had, was elected governor. I think about 300,000 votes were cast. Of course, at different times, poll tax, literacy tests, disenfranchising poor whites and African Americans. But at that point, 66% of the people who lived in Virginia lived in the countryside. Fast forward to the earliest years of the 21st century. I guess 2015 would qualify as one of them. The population of Virginia exceeds 8.3 million. As I mentioned, 51% of the people who live here are from elsewhere. And 66% of the people who live in the state live in a suburban or urban setting, mostly in that eastern crescent that extends from outside Washington down Interstate 95, scooping up a bit of the Petersburg area, and then swinging southeast to the seacoast. That's where the votes are. That's where the economic power is. It's that region and its growth that are nationalizing Virginia's politics. There are ways, however, to corrupt that. And one way is this this funky schedule of elections. Now, I'm not complaining. It's kept me employed for 36 years. But when this schedule was put in place, largely as a consequence of the 1851 Constitution, which established a four-year term for a four-year non-renewable term for a popularly elected governor. There was a minor adjustment which established that the gubernatorial election would follow the presidential election. But throughout the late 19th century and through most of the 20th century, when this was a one-party state controlled by a very conservative Democratic oligarchy, this was great. Because what it assured was that national politics would have a minimal effect on state politics. And that the lower the turnout, the greater the likelihood that those nasty national Democrats would not infiltrate the cherished Virginia Democratic large D exercise. And this perpetuated, as I said, this status quo. It's now used to full effect by the ins, the Republicans. And I find it fascinating because it wasn't too long ago that a lot of the Republicans who are now in charge of the General Assembly were screaming and yelling, why do we always have all these elections? Why don't we, one, identify people by party on the ballot, and there was some agreement on that, the Democrats balked. But there was no interest whatsoever in consolidating elections. Now, I don't know that the Republicans' motive was entirely altruistic. They said, well, we could save people money. We wouldn't have to worry about wearing out the electorate all the time. Well, there was a great Republican trend afoot nationally, so the Republicans knew, or certainly hoped, that that tide would continue to lift their vote at least at the statewide level. That hasn't happened, and I suspect there are a lot of Republicans who have conveniently forgotten advocating a change in the political schedule. We can talk a bit about that as well, but what does this election, this Groundhog Day election, augur in terms of the productivity of state government? Will relations improve in any way between Governor McAuliffe and the Republican legislature? I had a conversation with some Republicans last night, and it's certainly my hope that they don't, because reporters vote for good copy. And the crummier the relationship between the legislature and the governor, the better the story. That may mean trouble for folks like yourself and local government who have problems to solve, but it keeps my heart rate up. Medicaid expansion. It's quite clear that Governor McAuliffe is still interested in that. It's quite clear that Speaker Howell is not. But I don't think that it's state this in the positive. I think it's clear that there are a lot of Republicans, even in leadership, who would love to see some of that money. And if there was some way that they could get their hands on it, what that might portend in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, relieving pressure on the general fund side of the budget. So we're going to go through that struggle again. This go-around, there seem to be two new elements, and actually not too new if one considers the history of these issues. The hospitals are now volunteering to tax themselves so that they might have access to some of this Medicaid money. And also there is a renewed interest in fully deregulating the hospital industry in the state, doing away with these so-called certificates of public need. These are issues that have been before the Assembly for years. On the so-called, we call it the sick tax, the Belial's administration, anyone remember Jerry Belial? It considered a sick tax to deal with a shortfall in Medicaid, far lighter than the kinds of shortfalls that we had to deal with in recent years. L. Douglas Wilder also proposed a bed tax. That didn't go anywhere. And I can't imagine that there's a lot of interest, at least based on soundings among Republicans, in enacting that now. So don't get your hopes up. Firearms rights. The governor keeps talking about doing more. Some of these horrific episodes around the country, and certainly in Virginia, most recently at Smith Mountain Lake, live and on television, has heightened people's interest in the gun issue. Those who favor restrictions and those who don't. By the way, the lack of legislative agreement on some of these issues has, over the years, compelled the governor to react to the legislature much the way Barack Obama does to the Congress of the United States, fully testing the limits, or attempting to fully test the limits of executive power, doing things one-off by fiat that are ordinarily achieved through consensus between the legislative and executive branches. And one example, one fairly recent example, The governor, shortly before the election, and I think it was clear this had more to do with getting Democrats excited and maybe strengthening security in state office buildings, issued an executive order banning firearms from state office buildings. Big splash, lots of attention, but I found far more interesting the Republican response, the Speaker's response. In effect, not so fast. This doesn't apply to the buildings that are under legislative branch control, the state capitol and the General Assembly building, which even before the gun rights crowd started showing up in big numbers were free fire zones, figuratively. By the way, I know that you all are big grassroots advocates for your cause and spent a lot of time in Richmond in January and February. I don't know if any of you have been there the same day as the gun rights advocates show up. It requires special steps by the Capitol Police to accommodate those who have concealed weapons permits so that they can more easily enter and leave the building. So Virginia remains a hospitable place, even for gun rights people. The legislature is going to be working on, many I suspect would like to say with the governor on his only budget. The Virginia governor, because of this single non-renewable term, has only one budget that's his and his alone. And I'm hoping that before I get out of this racket, we're going to be able to say a Virginia governor introduces a budget that is hers and hers alone. 2-year behemoth. This one is likely to be about $100 billion. And it's going to be a budget that is a bit more stable than its immediate predecessors in that President Obama and the Republican Congress come up with an agreement on federal spending that is in place into 2017. So that means diminishes greatly, if not eliminates altogether, the possibility of automatic across-the-board spending cuts. That big, nasty word, sequestration. So there'll be federal dollars flowing uninterrupted to Virginia. That's going to make life a lot easier for the administration and for the legislature in trying to figure out what to do with this money. $100 billion, that's a lot of goodies. And that may present an opportunity for the governor on some of the things that he would like to do, so that perhaps there is some sense of common cause when the legislature meets this winter. One of the areas in which he promises to spend more, though he's been somewhat vague about how he'd like to spend it, is education. And I know you in local government have been in a state, or as my late English mother-in-law would say, a bait over what is happening to your budgets, particularly those of you from the countryside. Depending on whose arithmetic you believe, there's about a 7% hole right now in the school budget. And this is largely a consequence of the downturn of the economy. Governor McAuliffe wants to spend more money on teacher salaries. In rural Virginia, I would think that that is a big help. You don't have the broad tax base that Fairfax, Loudoun, Henrico, Chesterfield has, where there were largely seamless moments through the recession. The administration would also like to do something about some of the more troubled urban school districts. Petersburg, Richmond, Norfolk. The other thing that the governor would like to do is something more with community colleges, the 23 of them. This is, of course, the legacy of the Godwin years, Community colleges popped up all around the state. The governor believes that they should be partners with industry. This was what Governor Godwin had in mind when the system was first put in place, that the community colleges can be training centers, places to get local people up to snuff so they can do the job for extant and expanding in new industries. That may present an opportunity for some unanimity. What about some of the issues that are really important to you guys? And I was reminded of this when I visited with Joe Hale and Maggie Poole, who were opponents for a supervisory seat in Wibb County. And that is, wouldn't it be nice if Richmond gave to the counties the same authority that it gave to the cities? What I find fascinating about that issue, the lopsidedness of authority, is that so often, I've heard this from legislators, Democratic and Republican, Richmond does not have a monopoly on all the right ideas. So why not allow local government to be in a stronger position to meet the needs of its people? There is a footnote to all of this, and it's one that it's inside baseball, but it is one that fascinates me nonetheless, and that is redistricting. You know, before the Republicans had a field day with it, the Democrats did. And for the most part, before things like the Voting Rights Act, before the Supreme Court decisions on one man, one vote, Democrats were happy to ignore this decennial exercise in boundary drawing. And Democrats were happy to kind of thwart the will of growing and diverse segments of the electorate by resisting single-member districts and continuing to elect members at large instead of representing a specific area. A kind of cluster of candidates would be representing a certain area. They would run, these clusters of candidates would run as slates. And I must tell you, it was quite clear that there were a lot of, shall we say, underwhelming people who were elected to the legislature under this continuing at-large system. People pulled along by much stronger, much more able candidates and legislators. Well, by 1981, it was clear that, one man, one vote, and the Voting Rights Act were going to be used to full effect to force Virginia to complete its transition to something that passed for democracy. The Senate had pretty much moved to single-member districts. The House finally did, but under duress. And it was that shift to single-member districts that also hastened the rise of the Republican Party as a legislative party. In 1982, there was something seemingly unprecedented. There was a special election in an even-numbered year, in a federal year, for the House of Delegates. And candidates ran for one-year terms. And I think there's something powerfully symbolic in this. Among those elected that year was a guy by the name of George Allen. By the way, at that time, he was not wearing cowboy boots. He was still wearing proper shoes. And this Republican ascent, again, on the legislative side, continued all through the 80s. The Democrats would sweep the statewide offices, the Republicans would gain. And it established the local foundation that the Republicans had largely lacked at that point. In 1991, the Democrats, clearly running out of votes, energy, and steam, used their numbers and a Democratic governor to promote, for at least another decade, Democratic control. I must tell you, and I hope I'm not alone in this regard, that following the 1991 redistricting, when local boundary lines were completely ignored, that I would find myself traveling around Virginia and have no idea in whose district I was standing. Some of these districts are just amazing. They do resemble squash bugs on windscreens. By 2001, the Republicans are in charge. The first Republican speaker, Vance Wilkins, works his magic, and a Republican majority in the House of Delegates was firmly established. And I remember a conversation once with then Speaker Wilkins, who said that the Republican House majority was bulletproof, his word, at 54. And it was amazing. Even as the Democrats were making gains, they just couldn't get past that. So it was a good read and clearly a very successful redistricting on the Republicans' part. 2010 rolls around, the census 2011. Bill Howell is in the Speaker's chair. The Democrats have a nominal majority in the Senate. There is an amazing redistricting plan proposed by both. They are vetoed largely symbolically by Governor McDonnell. New plans are sent up, not terribly significant changes. The template is set, and Republicans have a 2-to-1 majority in the House, and the Senate is pretty much 50-50. I think that you could make the argument that, as frustrating as this may be if you're a Democrat, that, maybe these boundaries are truly representative of Virginia, in that they are, in many respects, truly representative of voters' inattention. Sometimes you get the government for which you just didn't bother to vote at all. And so clearly, there's a lot of pressure on legislators and local elected officials to really educate voters how essential it is to participate in these elections. I recognize that there are these institutional obstacles to participation. Now that is subject to challenge. There have been 3 lawsuits filed against the challenging redistricting plans. 2 of them are in federal court, and they are nakedly partisan responses to nakedly partisan activities. Democrats trying to do through the courts what they could not do in the halls of the legislature, undo a Republican-authored first congressional redistricting plan, second House of Delegates redistricting plan. In challenging the congressional redistricting plan, the Democrats won. Challenging the House of Delegates redistricting plan, the Democrats lost. And I don't know how closely any of you followed that, but it's just a reminder that it really depends on who the judges are. Because in the congressional case, the judge who wrote the dissent in the legislative case wrote for the majority. That was Bob Payne, a U.S. District Court judge in Richmond, who basically said, look, yeah, it's partisan gerrymandering, but the United States Supreme Court says that's kosher. There's one more case, and this has been pushed by a redistricting reform group called One Virginia 2021. And it was filed in state court and the Circuit Court of Richmond. A relatively new judge has been assigned to hear the case. And it alleges that the boundaries in the House and the Senate are inconsistent with the standards set by the Virginia Constitution, not by federal law, not by the federal Constitution, by the Virginia Constitution. And the Virginia Constitution establishes very narrow standards that districts should be compact and contiguous and, in effect, reflect communities of interest. Well, I guess they're contiguous in that, one is alongside another. Compact. I think maybe you have seen some of these districts. And I think, squash bugs on windscreens might apply. It's the interest of the advocates for this case to get it before the Virginia Supreme Court. But there's something funky going on at the Virginia Supreme Court. Governor McAuliffe made an interim appointment of a Fairfax Circuit Court Judge, Jane Marm Roush, to the court. The Republican legislature, in effect, took her hostage and wanted to, because the Republican legislature was worried about what was going on with redistricting. And the Republican legislature apparently figured it could trade the McAuliffe appointment for McAuliffe backing off on any sort of changes in redistricting. Well, that didn't happen, and now the Republicans have a hostage for which they haven't been able to trade anything just yet. Now, the Speaker and Tommy Norman, the Republican majority leader, though maybe not much longer, and just imagine the things he can accomplish as Finance Committee Chairman rather than floor leader, have said they want to get rid of Jane Marm Roush. If only to remind the governor that the Constitution of Virginia says that the legislature shall elect, those are the words, not shall confirm, shall affirm, shall elect members of the judiciary. And the Republicans who control the legislation now are no different than the Democrats who controlled it when I started doing this. That judicial patronage is something that the legislature jealously guards. So let's see if the Speaker and Mr. Norman make good on their threat. I would only ask, and maybe this is because I think the way the story is going to unfold, is there not some peril, political peril, in a majority, largely white male majority, removing for the first time from an appellate court a woman, a highly skilled, highly regarded woman? What's accomplished, again, what's accomplished there other than giving me something to write about? So the Supreme Court, watch it. Now, I have been filibustering. I'd be happy to take any questions or comments, because Jim Campbell is going to give me the hook, since I believe you have a board meeting coming up. So,
hi Jeff, I'm Bill Kiger from Rockingham County. Yesterday we had Tom Davis here, and he was talking about the redistricting issue and the shrinking middle. There have been suggestions by many university types, people that may be perceived to be liberal on some side and conservative on the other, that the fair and balanced way to do modern redistricting is to take it out of the human hands and put the data into the computers and let the computers draw the line. I'd like to hear what your comments are about that and how you might think that may change the body politic of Virginia.
well, just a footnote to this business of redistricting. About 2 weeks ago, I was attending a talk at the Virginia Historical Society by Richard Norton Smith, a presidential historian, who had recently completed a very good biography of Nelson Rockefeller, the only governor I knew growing up in New York. And he was asked a question about, the inability of elective bodies to get anything done. And Mr. Smith is a Republican. And he said, I'm going to get in trouble saying this, but I think the problem is redistricting, and something's got to be done to depoliticize it. Now, that was unbidden, and that room exploded in applause. So I think that this issue of stacking the deck through redistricting it registers with people. It may not register with a lot of people, but it's clearly evident that people recognize that when politicians shop for voters and voters don't shop for their politicians, that you end up with some peculiar results. I doubt seriously that in Virginia, the elective class is prepared to give up that power. And I would think, particularly for the Republicans, who have been reduced to a legislative power, that that is not a prerogative they're prepared to relinquish. So there are powers at work that are more powerful than computer software that can surgically create legislative districts, and that's population growth and demographic change. That is going to bring down a lot of these barriers. And the Republicans are aware of that, and if using the presidential results as an example, as any sign of that, again, depending on how one counts them, there were about roughly 12, maybe roughly 16 House of Delegates districts now represented by Republicans that were carried by President Obama. And there were another 10 in which they came very close. One of them was the Speaker's. And the Speaker's hereby.
Appreciate your talk today. You mentioned something about running as an independent at the local level. In Campbell County, where I was just elected and the chair of the board, we have a highly Republican majority in that county. And I ran as a Republican, and so did another person who was elected as well. And we felt like, why shouldn't we run as Republicans? That's the base. We have an organization, and we have the issues of conservative fiscal responsibility and those things that resonate with Republicans, and so why shouldn't we?
Well, why shouldn't you? Why shouldn't you? Dan Gecker, who I mentioned earlier, stood for the Chesterfield board the first time as a Democrat and was defeated. When he was elected as an independent. Now, Campbell County, if memory serves, the Republican organization out there has been warring among itself for some time. And was it the Campbell County Republicans who were among those who were trying to get a case through into the federal courts, like the Augusta Republicans, over how nominations were settled?
Yeah, we had a mass meeting where some came and wanted to take over the party, and they did. But then it was appealed to the state party, and they said, you must have a new mass meeting. And so we did, and elected as a chairman, one of our supervisors, and the others boycotted it, and they ended up on the outside. And so then they ran as independents, kind of saying, we really are Republicans too.
Are you one of those?
No,
outside?
not.
I see you're not wearing your tinfoil hat.
But anyway, we had a spirited contest, and I won by a landslide, I guess 55.5%. And it was a very bitter contest. They called us all kinds of names, said that we would serve the party bosses, one particular boss. Now when he calls me, I say to my wife, my boss is on the phone. It's hilarious. Maybe that would happen. So we tried. There was a lot of stuff in the newspapers back and forth, and then my name wasn't even on the ballot the day before the election. And so we wondered what was going on with that. The race wasn't even on the ballot for one of the precincts. And so that was going to make a difference.
I don't know. I don't personally have a problem with, IDing candidates, all the way up and down the ballot. I would only suggest to you as local elected officials, congratulations. At your level, party labels fade in significance very quickly. People want the job done.
Right. I agree.
We have time for 2 or 3 more questions. Unless you want to let Mr. Schapiro off easily.
I see that, by the way, and Emmett Hanger is here, so, Emmett in Augusta County, nothing pleases Emmett Hanger more than having more and more libertarian and Tea Party opponents. Because the more narrowly sliced his opposition vote is, the better his chances are with his re-election and renomination. So.
Any other questions? Here we go.
Rick's off in Isle of White County. She were down in southern.
Is the Guano Works?
What's that?
Is the Isle of Wight Guano Works still in business? There used to be a Guano Works down there.
Oh yeah, yes, I mean, yeah, it's an old business.
So just it's pleased to know that stuff is piled higher and deeper in places other than
in that particular county, I feel blessed that generally our candidates do not run on party affiliations. I certainly concur with what you said. I think one of the benefits of a local election is you tend to know the candidate. Oftentimes you know the family they came from, you might have gone to school with them, you know their character, and you know who they are as a people. So you're voting for an individual and what he brings to the office and stuff. Having said that, I was wondering, and we had some comments yesterday, there seems to be somewhat of an angry movement in the country in general. I was talking to a fellow yesterday, and one day he was just part of the community, he got elected, and then he was the enemy. And one day he was the enemy. Do you see this in local elections, that just the fact that you have now become part of a local government, And I was red softened yesterday, and I'm red softened today, but all of a sudden, everybody sees you different. Do you see a rise in that as far as the perception of people in government?
Well, I think it's certainly evident at the state level, and I think it's really sort of been evolving in Virginia since the election of George Allen in 1993. And with particularly in 1995, with the midterm legislative elections, where there was a big push by the Allen administration to elect Republicans, and do it in much the same way that Republicans had succeeded nationally, Newt Gingrich and the Contract for America. That the lines are brighter is clear. Redistricting sadly reinforces this. So if you are a Republican, you have to be mindful of the right, because that's where the challenges are. These districts, again, are drawn to create, to elect a certain member of a certain party, or a certain party. With the Democrats, the threat remains on the left, because these districts are so non-competitive. The problem that creates is that when, using the legislature of Virginia as an example, is that when these cats get to town, they talk past each other. They don't talk with each other. And my greatest concern about redistricting, and I think this speaks to your point, is that it breeds incuriosity. A lot of legislators, this is Democrats and Republicans, because their districts are drawn in such a way to empower a fairly narrow band of the electorate, they will be hyper-mindful of the issues that drive those voters. And they tend to be less interested in issues that may have a broader application beyond the borders of their district. That's a problem. Now, what it also means is that the lobbyists, who are experts in their issues, most of the time, have even greater influence, because they're not only a source, an important source of information, they make it easy for that information to be consumed by putting down a marker called a campaign contribution. So I'm interested in competitive districts, not just because it would give me more to cover. I think it would make for different types of legislators. I think not just more competitive legislators, but more intellectually aggressive legislators. And maybe you'd see that as well at the magisterial level, depending on the way some of these districts are drawn in some of these jurisdictions. It might not be as evident in Isle of Wight County as it might be in Prince William County or Fairfax County, Chesterfield, and Henrico. I don't know that I answered your question. I may have suggested that there's some other issues. And one other factor that I think is contributing to this. Politicians have enormous competition when it comes to telling their stories. They're not just competing with the other person who's running for the office, whether it's in a primary or if it's in a general election. It's all that other stuff that kind of fills the air. It's 24-hour news and around-the-clock entertainment and nonstop sports and movies. And now that this has become highly personalized, or whatever it is that's streaming on your mobile phone, the opportunities for a politician to tell his or her story under those conditions are very tough. They literally have seconds to do it anyway. So they need something that kind of pierces that media static. And I think, unfortunately, what happens is most of it's fairly trivial. Now, say what you will about Jim Gilmore's gubernatorial campaign in 1997, but he really broke the code on this. He reduced the message to 3 syllables, not just 3 words, 3 syllables, no car tax. And, a lot of people have very different opinions on that, that issue, and I'll make this point and then I'll stand down. But it seems to me that in the 12th largest state in the country, in which the economy is now driven by services, you know, people make more money doing things for people than making things. There's got to be a more reliable and a fairer way to harness the wealth of a state like that than continuing to tax them on a hard asset that is constantly declining in value. But the problem with the Gilmore Initiative is that it didn't deal with the larger issue of modernizing the tax system. And, you know, I don't need to remind you in local government, that's something that you guys have been talking about for years. That's not going to happen in Virginia unless a governor makes a full-on commitment to that. And it might not happen in Virginia until perhaps the only in Virginia prohibition on self-succession for the governor is done away with. It's something that's going to take some time, but, you know, I would suggest it's really long overdue. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. We really appreciate your analysis of the elections, and this meeting is always held in a really good time because we're all very aware of what has happened the previous Tuesday, whenever this meeting is held. We will take a 15-minute break and return for the annual business meeting, and I expect to see every one of you back here.